Queen Elizabeth, the wife of King Edward IV, is hailed by history as a woman of not only great beauty, but also exceptional intelligence, strategic foresight, and cunning. Yet few know that this great woman was once merely a commoner widow with 2 children, and to achieve the fame the world praises, she had to endure countless storms and scandals within the royal court. The story takes place in England during the Wars of the Roses, when the 2 branches of the monarchy, the House of York, symbolized by the white rose, and the House of Lancaster, symbolized by the red rose, erupted in a war for the English throne. Under Edward's leadership, the position of the House of York became increasingly secure. The young, handsome Edward was to be crowned the new king. At this time, Elizabeth, a widow with 2 sons, stood waiting on the road Edward was sure to take. Elizabeth's beauty captured Edward's attention, but her purpose was to reclaim her late husband's confiscated property. However, Warwick, the powerful noble who helped put Edward on the throne, realized Elizabeth's deceased husband belonged to the hostile House of Lancaster. Elizabeth argued that her husband was simply loyal to his cause, and furthermore, her children were innocent. Elizabeth's eloquence impressed Edward even more, but most importantly, he was utterly captivated by her beauty. He then announced he would visit her home the next day and asked Elizabeth to write down her demands beforehand. The following day, Edward arrived as promised. The moment he saw Elizabeth, Edward could not control himself and kissed her, much to her mother's shock. Just then, her father and brothers suddenly returned. Seeing Edward, the family's enemy, the atmosphere immediately grew tense. Edward, wishing to avoid rigidity, took Elizabeth's petition and promised her that he would restore all her rights. He then invited her for a walk in the garden. Since the political situation was still volatile, Edward needed to be ready for battle at any moment. He delicately expressed his desire for Elizabeth to join him at his lodgings that night, saying he had been smitten since first sight. But Elizabeth skillfully refused to become the king's mistress. Rebuffed, Edward resorted to moral pressure, saying he might die on the battlefield. Could you not grant even a final wish? But with her insightful judgment, she replied that a cunning man like Edward would not perish so easily. Elizabeth's witty retort delighted Edward, making him even more determined. He told Elizabeth to meet him at sunset the next day, under the great oak tree where they first met. Although Elizabeth refused to be his mistress, she still came to the oak tree. Edward removed her hairpins, letting her long hair fall loose, and whispered sweet nothings close to her ear. He then spread his cloak on the ground and invited her to sit. As Elizabeth sat down, Edward immediately wanted to pursue his desire. Although Elizabeth was a widow with 2 children, she was certainly not an easy woman. She continuously refused to be King Edward's mistress. Elizabeth drew a dagger and held it to her own throat, threatening to take her own life if the king dared to approach her further. When the sharp blade cut a slight mark on her neck, Edward reluctantly gave up. He stood up regretfully, walked away, and said, "You will never see me again." Watching Edward leave, Elizabeth was still terrified, but recalling Edward's last words, she regretted her decision. Just then, her mother arrived. Elizabeth's mother, Jacquetta, had once married the younger brother of Henry V. Widowed at only 20, her past experiences had shaped her into an extraordinary woman. Jacquetta told Elizabeth that the country was unstable, suggesting she wait until the situation was clearer before making a decision. Then her mother led Elizabeth to a deep river in the forest and asked her to choose one of 3 threads. Elizabeth accused her mother of being a witch, but her mother replied that no one would know. They were descendants of the river goddess Melusi, a power passed down through their bloodline. Elizabeth chose a thread. She followed her mother's instruction to reel in a small portion each day, awaiting the answer the thread would bring. That day, when Elizabeth returned home, she discovered her father and brothers were answering the king's call to arms, and Edward would march through here the day after. Elizabeth sensed this was her chance. She went to the river late at night to reel in the thread and found a coronation ring attached to the end. The next morning, her mother knew the king would soon march past. To create an opportunity for her daughter to meet the king, Jacquetta suggested the whole family go and send the king off tomorrow, showing support for the House of York. So, the next day, the entire family wore the white rose emblem of the House of York to bid farewell to the soldiers. Edward approached Elizabeth and confessed that he had lost sleep thinking of her for days. Elizabeth finally confessed her true feelings. Knowing Elizabeth loved him deeply, Edward was certain he could not go to battle with regret. He asked if she would marry him. Edward and Elizabeth promised to marry in secret at dawn the next day at their small church. Seeing the radiant smile on her daughter's face, Jacquetta knew the matter was settled. The next day, they were secretly married, witnessed only by the priest and her mother. Although the ceremony was simple, the consummation could not be omitted. The thoughtful mother-in-law handed her son-in-law a key, saying that the nearby hunting lodge was prepared. Immediately after their secret marriage, the husband had to leave for battle. Before departing, the husband warned Elizabeth not to disclose their marriage to anyone. After giving his instructions, Edward rode away. At this moment, her younger brother, who had been hiding in the corner, shouted at Elizabeth. He thought Elizabeth had become King Edward's mistress and scolded her for disgracing the family. To explain, Elizabeth showed his brother the ring on her ring finger. Her brother immediately thought his sister had been tricked by that scoundrel. They were secretly married in a small church, and then Elizabeth was told not to reveal the news. His brother asserted that when the king returned from the battlefield, he would deny everything. He was the king of England. He would marry a beautiful princess, not a widow with 2 children who had to beg him for favor on the roadside. Elizabeth loudly retorted that her brother's thought process was utterly wrong, but doubt still took root in her heart. News of the victory spread quickly. The Lancaster army was completely defeated. Henry VI fled and was captured. No one now questioned Edward's right to the English throne. Returning from the battlefield, the first thing Edward did was visit Elizabeth, whom he missed dearly. They shared sweet moments after their time apart. Elizabeth cautiously asked if they could now make their marriage public. But Edward said it was still too soon. Lord Warwick, who had supported his accession, was arranging a marriage for him with the French princess. He wanted to thwart his plan before telling him the truth. But Elizabeth felt deeply uneasy about this answer. He even said he enjoyed the secrecy of their moments together. Hearing words straight out of a betrayer's mouth, Elizabeth grew more distressed. After Edward returned to the palace, he sent love letters to Elizabeth every day. But in those letters, there was no mention of when their marriage would be made public, nor any word that could prove their relationship. Elizabeth grew increasingly anxious. Her mother told Elizabeth that her father had been summoned to court that morning, along with other nobles. Jacquetta guessed this was surely to announce a marriage, but it turned out to be someone else's. According to the news, Princess Bona of France had arrived at the palace. But at the last minute, Edward went against the wishes of Warwick, the great lord who helped him win the kingdom. Edward announced before everyone, "We are honored and pleased to inform everyone that I have married Elizabeth, my lady." Upon receiving this news, Elizabeth was overjoyed, but the thorny road ahead for her had just begun. After the marriage was revealed, Elizabeth went to meet her mother-in-law, Duchess Cecily. However, from their first meeting, her mother-in-law showed contempt for Elizabeth simply because she was a commoner from an ordinary family and a widow with 2 children. She expressed disapproval. Elizabeth was speechless for a moment, but her mother Jacquetta stepped forward and said, "It is regrettable, but we are all very happy." Her mother-in-law wanted to bring up their secret wedding, but Jacquetta immediately retorted, saying they were privately married, not secretly. She was present at the wedding, and if Duchess Cecily was not, she should ask her son why he did not invite her. Her mother-in-law then challenged the fact that Elizabeth had already borne children. "That is good news. This proves that my daughter is fertile and can quickly bear her husband an heir." The mother-in-law, defeated, angrily threatened that if she severed ties with her son Edward to let her second son inherit the throne, they would be left with nothing. At this moment, Jacquetta, the elder woman, began to recount old rumors. "You slept with your husband's friend, but I am sure a woman of your standing would never do such a thing. But if you did, Duchess Cecily, then you admit that you are a licentious woman, and your son, the king, is merely a bastard. Otherwise, I cannot think of any way you could strip him of his throne." The outcome of the first confrontation was clear. Elizabeth, protected by her mother, stepped forward and asserted her queenly authority. "I believe you should know that upon meeting the Queen of England, you must kneel." Though extremely reluctant, Duchess Cecily had to kneel before the Queen. The feud between the two officially began as Elizabeth entered court. Next was the magnificent coronation ceremony for the Queen. Elizabeth was bathed and dressed by her ladies-in-waiting, donning a dazzling yellow coronation gown. King Edward's 2 younger brothers stood at the door, offering praise and congratulations to their sister-in-law. A little nervous, Elizabeth asked where Edward was, but Warwick, who resented her becoming queen, said the king would only observe the ceremony from behind a screen in the church. He then arranged for his two daughters to stand behind Elizabeth as her escort. But Elizabeth's father stepped in and said Queen Elizabeth had her own sister, and Warwick's daughters could follow behind them. In the moment of her daughter's coronation, her father gripped her hand firmly, allowing no mistakes. Elizabeth rode in the royal carriage in her ceremonial robes, receiving cheers and affection from the people lining the streets. The scene was grand enough to show how much Edward cherished her. The carriage arrived at the abbey. Elizabeth was helped down, and her brother removed her shoes. She walked barefoot on the blue carpet strewn with fresh flowers, solemnly stepping into the church towards her queen's throne. The bishop anointed Elizabeth's forehead with oil, adding to the glory bestowed on the queen. Then he placed the ring of status on her finger, gave her the scepter, and finally crowned her. Probably no one before this had ever imagined that this widow with two children could ever sit on the throne of the Queen of England, and all this was thanks to Edward's love for her. Not only that, but Edward defied the risk of offending France by inviting the House of Burgundy to the autumn hunt, simply because the House of Burgundy was related to Queen Elizabeth. This greatly displeased Warwick, who was constantly trying to reconcile England and France. Elizabeth wanted to maintain good relations with the king's cousin, but Warwick, ignoring her, ordered her portrait burned right in front of Elizabeth. We do not need a queen who fantasizes about controlling her husband and ruling England. We do not need a manipulative, cunning woman. But Edward deliberately alienated France because he knew Warwick had signed a secret agreement with France. To prevent Warwick from monopolizing power, Edward had to allow other noble families to share the spoils. Thus, he began arranging marriages for Elizabeth's brothers and sisters to strengthen her family's influence. That day, Elizabeth was choosing marriage partners with her mother when she suddenly felt intense abdominal pain. Her first child with Edward was coming. The queen gave birth amidst painful cries. However, when the baby turned out to be a girl, a shadow of disappointment crossed the king's face. Edward had just ascended the throne and needed an heir to consolidate his power. The queen apologized to the king. Edward, who loved his wife deeply, was still very happy at the birth of their first child. Meanwhile, news of the queen giving birth to a princess spread throughout the city. Warwick returned home in delight. Warwick now was full of confidence because he held a wild card that would force Edward to listen to him. Not long after, the queen's youngest sister married a minor duke. Elizabeth brought her daughter to the ceremony. Her mother-in-law walked past and spoke maliciously, mocking Elizabeth for giving birth to a useless princess. Just then, the palace bell rang. Warwick had escorted Henry VI before Edward. Edward was naturally thrilled and immediately ordered Henry VI imprisoned in the Tower of London to reflect on his actions day and night. Warwick was greatly rewarded and regained the king's trust. Immediately after, he also presented his demands, hoping that his two daughters would marry Edward's two younger brothers. Edward promised to consider it. However, Queen Elizabeth vehemently opposed upon hearing the news. You can reward him, but not with this. You must make him understand that you are the one who decides. You are now the king. You cannot let his power grow too large and challenge you. Exaggerated by his wife, Edward finally decided to grant Warwick only some land. This infuriated Warwick. Knowing the queen was behind it, he became even more enraged. Clearly, the king was no longer easily controlled. So after 3 years of secret plotting, Warwick raised an army and rebelled, deciding to make Edward's younger brother, George, the new king. He quickly arranged the marriage between George and his eldest daughter. Upon learning of the betrayal by Warwick and his brother, Edward was both surprised and furious. The queen pricked her finger with a long needle. Fresh blood dripped on a leaf. Then she dipped a quill in the blood, wrote the enemy's name on a scrap of paper, and tucked it into a wax doll placed over a fire. Queen Elizabeth, as a descendant of the river goddess Marusi, was performing a magical curse on the enemies who had kidnapped her husband and killed her father and brother. Another turncoat. After capturing King Edward, Edward was still the King of England in name, so Warwick could only hold him captive. His daughter, who had married George, was now pregnant. Warwick immediately planned to summon a council to proclaim George king. However, despite their best efforts, the proposal was unanimously rejected by the council. Warwick became powerless as he failed to overthrow Edward. His brother was also not cruel enough to kill the king. Eventually, Edward was released and quickly rode back to his wife Elizabeth. Only when holding each other tight did they feel secure. They raised a toast to Edward's safe return. Elizabeth brought up the tragic deaths of her father and brother, insisting that Warwick must pay the price. However, Edward's attitude was different. He said what they needed most now was peace. The country could not endure any more war. Warwick and George had lost this time, and they would certainly beg for his forgiveness and submit to him later. Therefore, they were not only unpunished, but Edward even had to bestow the title of Duke on Warwick's nephew and even marry his eldest daughter, Princess Elizabeth, to Warwick's nephew. Elizabeth, of course, disagreed, as she refused to marry her daughter into the family of her enemy. But this time, Edward truly had no other choice. Although Edward adored Elizabeth, as king, he did not always heed every decision. Faced with political expediency, he would choose the path that disappointed Elizabeth. The queen could only stare powerlessly at the man who killed her father return to court unharmed. As the queen of the entire nation, she had to endure the sight of her enemies standing before her, untouched. Her anger turned into a formidable presence, and she vented her hatred in words and scolded Warwick's wife until the woman was terrified. Later, Elizabeth returned to a cheerful banquet. Her enemy boldly strode towards her, showing no remorse, and said she regretted killing her father and brother. As she was talking, her mother-in-law, Duchess Cecily, approached. Cecily was Warwick's cousin. Now that Warwick's eldest daughter had married Cecily's second son, the two families were naturally closer. The mother-in-law immediately mocked Elizabeth, saying her second daughter-in-law would soon bear a child, who might be the next heir to the throne. The vicious comments made Elizabeth leave abruptly. She sought out her mother and said she must bear a son. Jacquetta instantly understood her daughter's intent. Late at night, the two women secretly went to the river again. Elizabeth chose another thread. This time, the end of the thread was tied to a silver baby spoon. "Mother, I will bear a son named Edward." After returning, Elizabeth immediately sought out her husband to execute her plan to conceive. To humiliate Warwick's youngest daughter, Elizabeth ordered Anne, who was serving as her lady-in-waiting, to undress her. She then tossed her undergarments at Anne. Anne, a noblewoman, had never been treated this way. She ran back to her father, crying and recounting everything. Warwick comforted his daughter, saying their glorious moment would soon arrive. It turned out Warwick had not abandoned his ambition. He was still secretly plotting to overthrow Edward. 2 months later, a rebel army with a mysterious leader began its campaign. They claimed to want to restore Henry VI to the throne. Edward suspected this was the army of the former Queen Margaret, seeking to overthrow him. He had to lead the troops to suppress them. But Elizabeth did not want her husband to go to battle, as she was pregnant again. Edward was delighted by the news, which reinforced his determination to win. At this time, another important female figure during the War of the Roses, Lady Margaret, appeared. Margaret, who supported the House of Lancaster, always resented the role of Edward from the House of York. Hearing of the uprising, she instantly knew she had to seize this opportunity. Her brother-in-law told Margaret that the uprising was actually a plot by Warwick and George. They had secretly allied and promised that if they revolted against Edward, they would restore the dukedom to Margaret's son, Henry Tudor. For her son's sake, Margaret immediately returned to her childhood home to persuade her brother. She found a private moment to speak with him, saying that God had chosen him to join this war. Thus, her brother, who had never fought before, was tricked by Margaret. He led an army to battle alone. Upon reaching the battlefield, Jasper finally told his brother the truth. This was not a holy war for the House of Lancaster, but an internal plot by the House of York. His faith shattered, the brother could not accept the truth and defected to the enemy. He found Edward and told him that everything was a conspiracy by Warwick and George. Betrayed once again, Edward was so angry he struck the brother who had brought him the news. Men on the battlefield prepared to fight at any moment, while the women behind them began to pray. However, Margaret prayed all night, but still could not overcome Queen Elizabeth's magic. A grieving mother wept ceaselessly upon hearing her son had fallen in battle. Margaret, however, only cared about the unfolding events. She showed no remorse and criticized her brother for betraying the family. Warwick and George, the defeated ones, could only flee to their domain in shame. At this time, Warwick understood clearly that he would never regain Edward's trust. He could only choose to fully stand on the opposing side to put his son-in-law George on the throne. Warwick decided to sail to Calais to recruit an army, but his daughter Isabel said she could not set sail because she was about to give birth. But Warwick, at this point, cared little for his daughter's life. Queen Elizabeth, knowing Warwick planned to flee to Calais, knew she could not let them successfully recruit an army and threaten Edward's throne again. Furthermore, the death of her father had yet to be avenged. Elizabeth did not hesitate. Using her special power as a descendant of the river goddess, she filled an iron basin with water, removed her necklace, and began to spin it counterclockwise over the water, continuously blowing into the basin. Her mother and daughter sat opposite her, joining in the ritual. The effect of the three witches performing the rite together was unimaginable. At this moment, Warwick's family was sailing on the sea. Huge waves caused the ship to shake violently. Isabel went into shock and began to bleed. The harsh environments made the difficult childbirth even harder. Her sister Anne quickly gathered necessities. Without a midwife, the mother had to deliver the baby herself. The ship was about to reach the port of Calais, but the other side raised their cannons and began to attack, demonstrating their support for Edward. Warwick immediately ordered the ship to turn back into the storm. However, the baby was in a breached position and could not be delivered normally. The desperate mother grasped the hand of her youngest daughter, Anne, asking her to turn the baby because her hands were the smallest. Seeing her sister in agony, Anne bravely put her hand in. After immense pain, the baby was finally born, but there was no joy in the birthing room. Queen Elizabeth's curse had been fulfilled once again. At this time, Queen Elizabeth was pregnant again. George was still dreaming of his wife bearing him a son to compete with his brother Edward for the throne, but Warwick now considered George expendable. Warwick decided to marry his youngest daughter to his old enemy, the son of Henry VI, and prepared to ally with the former Queen Margaret to overthrow Edward and restore the reign of Henry VI. As his former strongest enemy, Warwick's initiative made the former queen suspicious of his motives. To test his loyalty, the former queen demanded Warwick swear on the cross. The former queen then assessed her future daughter-in-law, Anne, Warwick's youngest daughter. She looked closely at the girl, with eyes full of contempt. The innocent girl awaited her wedding night, but the mother-in-law burst into the room and pulled the blanket off her. She then took a white cloth from a servant and spread it beneath her. Anne, naive and inexperienced, was confused and distraught by her mother-in-law's overwhelming presence. Seeing the intimacy between the mother and son, she felt even more lost. Only when her son was ready did the mother-in-law leave the room in peace. The hasty political marriage dragged Anne into a nightmare. Anne's father Warwick, in his effort to overthrow Edward's rule, did not hesitate to seek out his old enemy, the former queen of the House of Lancaster, for an alliance. But the former queen was not as simple as Warwick thought. She demanded that Warwick attack England first to restore the throne to her husband, Henry VI. Once London was pacified, she would lead the army to pacify the rest of the country. Edward, who was in London, learned that Warwick, once his loyal servant, had allied with his brother and his enemy. Edward, betrayed, could not understand what was happening. Could his brother George forget their old feud and join the enemy who killed their father? While Edward was distressed, Jacquetta summoned her daughter Elizabeth to resolve the current predicament and weaken the powerful alliance of their opponents. The two went to Edward and George's mother, Duchess Cecily. Elizabeth told her mother-in-law that George had joined the House of Lancaster, saying, whether she believed it or not, George was currently in a very dangerous position. Jacquetta continued to analyze the situation, saying that Warwick was currently allied with the former queen to restore Henry to the throne. But if they failed, George would be the loser and guilty of treason, and Edward would have to execute his brother. Even if Warwick won, George would gain nothing, because Warwick had married his daughter Anne to the former queen's son. In that scenario, the former queen's son would inherit the throne, and George would never be king. After successfully capturing Cecily's attention with arguments of self-interest, Elizabeth proposed a solution, suggesting that George must be quite confused now. But his brother Edward would always welcome him back. He would restore George's title and property. He could even go to Silicon Valley to find a job. There were many opportunities there. Hearing this solution, the biased Cecily immediately dispatched her trusted retainer to secretly visit her daughter-in-law. First, they comforted Isabel over the loss of her child, opening her heart. Then they relate Cecily's message that returning to England was the best option for George. Isabel, who was deeply depressed, also desperately wanted to go home and said she would definitely pass the message on to her husband. Not long after, Edward prepared to fight. George, who had returned, revealed Warwick's plan to Edward. George said Warwick would lead an army to attack from the north, while the former queen would lead another army to attack from the south. Based on George's useful intelligence, Edward formulated a counter-strategy and confidently went to war. But he was still worried about his wife and asked her to stay strictly within the royal sanctuary of the Tower of London to await the birth in peace. Unexpectedly, just 10 days later, the rebel leader Warwick captured London, and Henry VI was about to be restored to the throne. This meant Elizabeth was no longer the Queen of England. Not only that, but Warwick ordered her mother arrested on charges of witchcraft. Danger lurked everywhere. Elizabeth, who was pregnant, immediately took her 6 children and fled the royal palace, hiding in a dilapidated abbey. To prove that the marriage of Edward and Elizabeth was illegal, Warwick accused the couple of being manipulated by Jacquetta's witchcraft in court. To bolster the accusation, Warwick spared no expense in hiring actors to coordinate the presentation. But Jacquetta calmly denied the accusation and began to defend herself. She demanded to summon a witness on her behalf. That's the rebellious queen whom he is currently serving. Warwick could not believe this woman has such powerful connections. But Jacquetta was not joking. When Margaret was 15, Jacquetta accompanied her to England. When Margaret was crowned queen, Jacquetta was the one who adjusted her gown. When Margaret gave birth to her son, Jacquetta was also by her side. I am her closest friend. If anything happens to me, she will hang your head on the city walls. This resolute statement stunned Warwick, leaving him utterly terrified because he was now allied with Queen Margaret. At this time, Elizabeth, hiding in the abbey, suddenly went into labor. Having no help made Elizabeth even more anxious. Just then, there was a frantic knock on the door. Elizabeth instructed her son to open it cautiously. Fortunately, the visitor was Jacquetta, who had been released without charge. Her mother's appearance finally allowed Elizabeth to breathe a sigh of relief. With her mother's meticulous care, Elizabeth stood and gave birth to her first son with Edward. At this time, Henry VI had only been restored to the throne for half a day when Warwick learned that George had betrayed him. The 3 York brothers had allied and could attack London at any moment. Warwick was forced to temporarily return King Henry VI to the Tower of London. Elizabeth was awakened by footsteps in the middle of the night. She quickly put on her shoes and opened the peephole to check the situation outside. She saw a dark silhouette rapidly approaching. Elizabeth immediately drew the dagger hidden under her pillow. Seeing the shadow come closer, despite her fear, she turned back to shield her children, while her mother calmly protected the baby. Only when the man opposite removed his cloak did his familiar face make her burst into tears. It was Edward, the man she longed for day and night. Edward was eager to see his baby son. The lovely child in his mother's arms made Edward even more determined to win. Elizabeth did not just empower her husband through morale, she also directly helped him through her magic. Moonlight shone through the window. 3 generations of witches stood beneath the window performing their spell. As they concentrated, mist spread everywhere, concealing the traces of Edward's army. He used 10,000 troops to ambush the rebels. After a fierce battle, they defeated the 30,000 troops commanded by Warwick. Warwick, who had once fought alongside them, was now Edward's greatest enemy. Edward watched unmoved as Warwick was stabbed repeatedly until he fell before him. Edward of the House of York regained the throne. The former queen and Henry VI were imprisoned in the Tower of London. Edward and Elizabeth were now enjoying happiness and reunion with their numerous children. The winner takes the crown, the loser is branded a traitor. That is all. Edward put on the crown and returned to court, receiving the obedience of everyone. Elizabeth also regained her status as queen, as if the war had never happened. The queen woke up in the middle of the night, but found her husband was not beside her. She went out looking and was surprised to find the 3 brothers in their night clothes secretly meeting in the hallway. They entered a secret room and bolted the door. Elizabeth leaned in to look through the peephole, but saw a shocking sight. King Edward held a pillow, smothering the sleeping Henry VI, while his 2 brothers tightly held Henry VI's legs. The 3 brothers worked together until the old king breathed his last. Outwardly, Edward forgave his rebellious brother and Warwick's 2 daughters, but in the shadows, against the old king who threatened his status, he revealed his cruel side. Yet Warwick's youngest daughter, Anne, still bowed in submission and was forgiven by Edward. As the daughter of a traitor belonging to the House of Lancaster, Anne was in a very difficult position at court. Although a widow, she inherited a huge estate, but she had no right to use the assets. Now her father and husband were both dead. Her brother-in-law, Duke George, became Anne's guardian. Her sister Isabel was happy that Anne was spared and survived. To better care for Anne, she planned to arrange for Anne to become her lady-in-waiting. Anne, however, was dissatisfied with this outcome. Moreover, her mother was still imprisoned in the abbey. She began to suspect the king's motive for keeping them close was to seize their immense fortune. But her sister warned Anne that she must show absolute loyalty to the king now. Moreover, her sister did not need to worry about her assets. She would naturally be provided with the dowry when she married. Anne said that because of these assets, her brother-in-law George might even imprison her to completely strip her of her freedom. Her sister found Anne's words increasingly absurd and tried to silence her. Failing to stop her words, she slapped her. Anne did not back down and pushed her sister to the ground. Queen Elizabeth was also very displeased that Edward easily forgave the traitor's wife. He completely disregarded the fact that Warwick was the enemy who killed her father. But her mother Jacquetta said that Edward did what he had to. England needed peace. Everything else could be overlooked. Although Elizabeth sat in the position of queen, her mother's vision was much broader than her own. That day, seeing the prince whine crying in George's arms, Elizabeth immediately took her son and handed him to a lady-in-waiting. George, who always enjoyed confronting Elizabeth, now revealed that the young prince would soon have to move away. Elizabeth was confused. Edward explained that after the young prince turned 2, he would have to live in another kingdom. His third brother, Richard, explained that only when the young prince was known by the people would they love him. In this way, the succession would not favor the House of Tudor. But Elizabeth was adamant about not leaving her son. Now, the 3 brothers were united and constantly planning together, which often made Elizabeth feel increasingly distant from her husband. She could not help but complain to her mother, but her mother just laughed and said that was not true. She had seen through the secret Elizabeth was hiding. It turned out the queen was pregnant once again. Jacquetta said to bring this happy news to her husband and all her current difficulties would be resolved. But Elizabeth did not know that she would arrive this time to find her husband having an affair with someone else. She intended to share the joy of her pregnancy with her husband. Instead, she received a surprise herself. Elizabeth never thought the husband who had sworn eternal love to her would also betray her. But her brother and mother comforted her that a king was bound to have mistresses. But Elizabeth could not suppress her jealousy. That evening, she went to Edward's study but only saw her 2 brother-in-laws secretly talking in the hall. George, who disliked Elizabeth, started trouble, saying her husband was intimate with another woman. The successive disappointments made Elizabeth feel downcast. She wanted to confide in her mother, but at this moment, she noticed her mother looked very ill. Elizabeth immediately prepared to send for a physician. Jacquetta said those doctors offered no cure other than bloodletting. Moreover, she knew her own condition well. She could feel her heartbeat was very strange, sometimes skipping a beat. As a descendant of witches, Jacquetta naturally had the ability to foresee her own fate. Her health was deteriorating rapidly. Elizabeth could not accept the truth, crying by the bedside. Her mother had stood by her through every hardship. Without her mother, Elizabeth would not have achieved the status and glory she had today. She dared not imagine what her future without her mother would be like. I haven't prepared myself. No one can prepare for this. Her mother's critical condition made Elizabeth so grief-stricken that she struggled during childbirth. Although this was her 7th child, the pain did not lessen at all. After a struggle, Elizabeth finally gave birth. However, due to the premature and difficult birth, the baby's breathing was very weak. It was destined to end its journey too soon. Elizabeth mournfully carried the baby to her mother's bed, placing the infant in her arms. Both the mother and the grandchild slowly drifted into eternal sleep. Elizabeth could finally no longer hold back, collapsing beside the bed, sobbing uncontrollably. She had lost the mother who loved her most. While Elizabeth was immersed in grief, the paths of others were secretly changing. Anne, to escape her brother-in-law's control, fell in love with Richard. The 2 quickly married. Meanwhile, Margaret of the House of Lancaster. Although her son Henry Tudor had fled England to save his life, Margaret never gave up her ambition to claim the throne for her son. An older widow, she brought her huge dowry and chose to marry Earl Stanley of the House of York. Stanley, a man who valued self-interest, quickly accepted Margaret's proposal, and they agreed on 3 conditions. They would be husband and wife in name only, without marital duties. Not long after their marriage, Margaret entered the court as Queen Elizabeth's lady-in-waiting, beginning her own path to power. Time sped forward to the birth of the Queen's 8th child. After a struggle, the Queen finally gave birth to another prince. However, the baby did not cry. Elizabeth was terribly distressed, suspecting she had been cursed. But immediately after, the baby cried its first cry in Margaret's arms. Elizabeth quickly took the child, tears streaming down her face. "You saved my son. I owe you a debt of gratitude." At this moment, Margaret's feelings were complex. As a mother, she also felt the miracle of life. It took her a whole year to gain Elizabeth's trust. It was not easy. Thus, the Queen entrusted her youngest son to Margaret's care. Now, King Edward, with 2 male heirs, began to harbor ambitions to expand his influence abroad. On the advice of his brother George, Edward declared war on France to reclaim lost territory and planned to appoint George as the regent of France. But Elizabeth opposed this idea. "You cannot give George that much power. He will betray you again."
Edward said George was his own brother, and a shared goal would bind them together. The three York brothers quickly gathered their army and set off. But the war had not even begun when the King of France sent an offer of peace. He not only promised to surrender territory, but also offered a large amount of gold and jewels. Achieving his goal without bloodshed, Edward gladly accepted France's peace proposal. However, his two younger brothers were unhappy. His third brother, Richard, felt the peace did not bring them honor and glory, while George was more eager than ever to become the regent of France. The relationship between the three brothers began to crack. Edward returned with a wealth of gold and jewels, while Richard resented being tainted by money. George grew even more greedy, even secretly dealing with the King of France. If the King of France provided troops to help George seize the throne, George would return all the ceded territory. Therefore, he greatly valued his wife's pregnancy, hoping she could bear him an heir. But Isabel, who was pregnant, was constantly worried. She believed the rumors and feared the baby in her womb had been cursed by the queen. So George prepared to use magic to defeat magic. He hired a male sorcerer to cast a spell on the queen. However, Isabel gave birth to a son soon after, but her health did not recover postpartum and she quickly died. Richard was certain that all this was due to Queen Elizabeth's magic. He also began to brainwash his sister-in-law Anne. But then he went to the king, asking permission to marry Mary of the House of Burgundy. However, Edward saw through George's ambition and refused. After Isabel's death, George would inherit a huge fortune. If he then married into the House of Burgundy, he could quickly expand his power. Lady Margaret, well informed about court news, selected carefully what she would tell the queen. She knew George had hired a male sorcerer, but chose to conceal that fact from Elizabeth. However, her husband, Stanley, to protect himself, immediately reported the matter to the king. The sorcerer was promptly arrested. Edward was also furious, accusing George of treason and bringing him to trial. King Edward had actually always seen through his brother George's ambition, but because George was his own brother, he had tolerated him many times. Now, George had not only hired a sorcerer to cast spells, but had also secretly colluded with the King of France to usurp the throne. Edward could not tolerate it anymore, and was determined to convict George of treason and execute him. The mother, to this moment, still believed Queen Elizabeth instigated the conflict between her two sons. Although Elizabeth resented George for killing her father, she felt no joy when Edward actually ordered George's execution. She wondered to Margaret, "The Bible says an eye for an eye, but it also says to love your enemy." Elizabeth decided to let go of her hatred and intended to persuade Edward to spare George's life. But this time, Edward was unwilling to compromise. His mother went from threatening to begging, and finally, discarding all pride, she knelt at her son's feet, pleading for forgiveness. But it was precisely because the mother always favored and indulged George time and again that he became the man he was, betraying Edward repeatedly. Edward's patience had reached its limit. Furthermore, being born into a royal family, the least important thing was perhaps brotherly affection. Ultimately, George chose to die by being drowned in a barrel of Malmsey wine. The three York brothers were officially disbanded. Elizabeth also took out the curse she had hidden in her jewelry box and threw it into the fire. Whether by man or by God's will, the two enemies she had cursed had paid the price. Subsequently, Edward agreed to bestow George's dukedom on Margaret's son, Henry Tudor, because Henry had previously been stripped of this title. Margaret received the royal decree and realized her son would soon return, but her husband Stanley said, "Although Henry has a right to the throne, the House of York currently has 5 heirs. Your Henry must step over the corpses of 5 people to ascend the throne." Margaret always held fast to the belief that her son would one day become king. Thus, she prayed day and night. Finally, 10 years later, Edward's health declined rapidly. He was about to die. The House of York was also about to face a great upheaval. The 30-year-old king suddenly coughed up blood and collapsed. Edward, on his deathbed, entrusted his son to his brother, appointing his brother Richard as regent to assist his son Edward in taking the throne. But Elizabeth clearly preferred her own brother for the position. When it came to power, they trusted their own family more. Therefore, Elizabeth prepared to dismiss everyone. "Everyone leave. I want to say goodbye to my husband." After everyone said their goodbyes and left, Elizabeth wanted to make one last effort, but Edward was determined not to waste his final words on state matters. Elizabeth had no choice but to give up, sadly resting in her husband's arms. In 1483, Edward IV died. The first successor was his elder son, the young Edward. Elizabeth naturally became Queen Dowager, but Duchess Cecily refused to kneel when meeting her, showing that her heart was still full of schemes. Power struggles began to erupt. Although Richard had promised his brother he would assist the young Edward on the throne, his wife, Anne, used the pretense of protecting the prince's safety to incite Richard to take Edward away from wherever he was and imprison him in the Tower of London. Elizabeth's envoys could not protect the prince. After hearing the news, she no longer trusted Richard's loyalty. To protect her other children, Elizabeth decided to flee to the abbey for sanctuary. However, after Elizabeth brought her children into the abbey, Richard was incited by his mother to send soldiers to surround the abbey. The hostility between the two sides was clear, and both waited for the other to act first. The person who benefited was Margaret. She continued to add fuel to the fire, sending news to Elizabeth that rumors were spreading outside that the late King Edward was a bastard. If the rumor was confirmed, Elizabeth and her son's status would be lost. Furthermore, her brother had been ordered arrested by Richard. Elizabeth acted decisively. That night, she secretly smuggled her youngest son out of the city, then found a boy with a similar appearance. Sure enough, the next day, Richard sent men to take Elizabeth's youngest son away, wanting complete control over the two heirs. The two young princes were imprisoned together in the Tower of London. Late at night, Elizabeth tore a strip of white cloth and tied it around her wrist, cursing Richard, cursing his army, his weak wife, and his sick children. During these days, although Richard outwardly kept his promise as regent, his innermost beliefs began to waver. Anne said that Edward was raised by his maternal uncle. If he became king later, he would only be manipulated by Elizabeth's family. At that point, their situation would be very dangerous. The best option now is for Richard to take the throne himself. Richard officially revealed his ambition. He knew he could not openly seize the throne, so he drug up old matters, saying Edward had secretly married another woman before marrying Elizabeth. Thus, Elizabeth's children would be bastards, and he would be the legitimate heir. Just like that, Richard stood before his nephew Edward, acting against his maternal uncle and his own half-brother. Richard then quickly ascended to become King of England.
At this time, Lady Margaret was waiting for the opportune moment, preparing to ally with the Duke to overthrow Richard. She secretly sent a messenger to Elizabeth, promising to help Elizabeth rescue her son on the condition that Elizabeth's eldest daughter, Lizzie, marry her son, Henry Tudor, and established Henry as Edward's heir to the throne. This meant her daughter would become queen later. Lady Margaret said this marriage would unite the houses of York and Lancaster, completely ending the war. Elizabeth had no other choice but to agree to cooperate. Margaret immediately wrote to her son in France, asking them to gather their army and prepare for battle. But her husband Stanley told Margaret, "Your plan is for your son to become king. If the prince dies, it will bring him 2 steps closer to the throne." Lady Margaret could not bear to harm the young prince she had helped save. But if she did not act, her son could not truly gain the people's support. Therefore, she had to make a cruel choice. Meanwhile, Queen Anne, before leaving the palace with the king, had also secretly ordered the execution of both princes. However, the rescue operation failed. Elizabeth only received the news of her son's death. She was desperate, huddling in a corner, crying miserably. That night, she and her daughter Lizzie invoked a curse on the enemy who had killed her son with the most vicious words. King Richard also discovered the Duke's betrayal and immediately sent him to the execution block. He also learned of Margaret's conspiracy with Duke Stanley. He went to inform Margaret that he had gained the king's trust, while Margaret had been convicted of treason. Stanley said the king had tasked him with supervising her. The king had ordered all her land and property transferred to Stanley's name. Margaret then realized that her opportunistic husband was not entirely on her side. But King Richard was also very surprised when his 2 nephews vanished from the Tower of London. So he secretly met with Elizabeth, wanting to know if she had secretly rescued her children. He promised that if the children were alive, he would not pursue them to the death. But Elizabeth angrily denied it, saying that she and her daughter Lizzie had cursed the enemy who had killed her son with the most vicious words. Richard later reached an agreement with Elizabeth. They could leave the church and return to their home province. Richard would protect the safety of the mother and daughter. The beautiful and mature Lizzie would also enter court life. Queen Anne, upon learning of Elizabeth's curse, began to feel anxious and uneasy. Not long after, her son began to suffer from a high fever and constant vomiting. The king, right in front of the queen, had a pretext to flirt with his niece. He did not even care about everyone's reaction. Since their last encounter, his niece Lizzie had matured. Richard summoned her to court to attend to him. While his son suffered from a high fever all night, he was outside holding his niece's hand, dancing. However, his son's condition did not improve. Whether it was due to Elizabeth's curse or not, the young prince quickly died.
At the funeral, Queen Anne was heartbroken, paying no attention to Richard's comforting hand. Lizzie witnessed this scene and actively stepped forward to comfort her uncle. The sight of them holding hands was also seen by everyone. Queen Anne's spirit was broken and she fell ill. A persistent doubt tormented her. So before she died, she summoned the warden of the Tower of London, asking him if he had carried out her order to kill the two princes. But the warden denied it. He had not carried out that action. But the two princes had indeed disappeared from the Tower of London. Knowing that the disappearance of the two princes was not her fault, Anne finally unburdened herself of the guilt. In the following days, Richard was constantly seen with his niece Lizzie. Anne no longer cared, but Richard now told Anne that he did it only to break the engagement between Lizzie and Henry Tudor. In this way, the entire House of York would submit to him. That day, a solar eclipse occurred over England. Margaret believed this was a sign from heaven. The rule of the House of York was about to end. A new king would arrive like a mighty dragon. Henry Tudor had set sail from France with an army. At this moment, Queen Anne died. Richard lost his support of the northern nobles, which directly cost him his advantage in the upcoming battle. Henry Tudor had been exiled abroad for 10 years, returned to English soil. He led his army bravely, finally defeating Richard and ending the rule of the House of York. Henry of the House of Tudor was crowned and married Lizzie, a princess of the House of York. Their marriage officially marked the end of the War of the Roses, ushering in a golden age in English history, the Tudor dynasty. Queen Lizzie later gave birth to Henry VIII. But remember the curse Lizzie and her mother cast? The enemy who killed her son, his house would become extinct. Perhaps this is why Henry VIII later failed to bear a son. The film ends here. Thank you for watching the entire video. Please leave a comment below with any film you would like me to do next. Goodbye, and see you again.